headhunter since I was 23. I have been selling retained and contingent because I am always a full desk recruiter. What that means is that I am responsible for landing searches for myself that I would then go ahead and fill. So in that scenario, you are a full desk, direct hire, permanent, whatever you want to call this. This is being a traditional headhunter, right? Like I'm retained or contained or contingently contracted by a client to go out to the open market to then find specific talent that qualifies for representation and fulfills the qualifications that the client is looking for. So let's talk a little bit about retained search because there seems to be a lot of questions around this. One of the biggest myths is that only executive search and retained businesses can do retained search. Now, what they don't understand is that retained search just means that a client retains you. Now, they can retain you for admin search, for a junior admin assistant, all the way up to a CEO. So there is no difference in terms of retainer that is so exclusive that you shouldn't be selling this as a basic recruitment person. Like if you work in the field of recruitment in direct hire, you gotta be selling retained because you might as well. Why would you not take money up front if you possibly could? Now, there are certain circumstances that you actually don't want to take money up front. I will go through those at the end of this video, so watch the whole thing. Let's talk about traditional search and why being retained makes sense. And before we even go into why it makes sense, again, let's dive into what it is exactly. It's when a client forks over money immediately upon starting the search. This is telling you, their headhunter, I care about you. I see that you are in a service business. And kind of like a lawyer, I'm paying you up front. Instead of waiting for you to win the case, I'm going to retain you. I'm going to pay you, right? You're going to get paid up front. And this is useful because yeah, you're going to need that money to maybe pay for marketing expenses. Certainly, you're going to need that money to kind of monopolize your time on servicing that client. And that's the whole point of a retainer, is that I'm giving you money and in exchange, I'm expecting service, which is very different than the expectation of contingent where I would love to get service. It would be great to get service, but because I haven't paid up front, I can't even really expect you to be like accountable. So a retainer is a way for both parties to put skin in the game. Obviously, if both parties are both reputable, moral people, right? That is kind of the expectation, is that you're not going to just take the money and run away and I'm never going to see you again. I'm never going to hear from you again. You only, as a client, you should be smart enough to only give money to good recruiters that actually are very well respected in those niche markets. And as a headhunter, if you do take retained money, you better deliver. And that's because your reputation is on the line. How can you go around town telling people you're the best recruiter if you can't even fill your retained searches? I mean, that is pretty awful. So on the headhunter side, it's critical that you make sure you don't fail. And if you do fail, it must be the client's fault, or else you cannot really survive from a reputation perspective, right? So only take on searches and pitch retainers to deserving clients because you don't want to be married to undeserving clients. And there are a few different factors to consider. And if you follow my channel, you're going to get more information about all of these topics because there's just so much to cover. So back to retainers and how they work. You and the client both agree that you're going to put skin in the game in form of payment to lock up your time so that the search can be dealt with in a sincere and thoughtful way. And that's obviously how you should sell it. There's a whole nother, chapter on how to sell retainers, and that's a different video. And how retainers work is that there's usually just two options. One is a 2-part retainer, one is a 3-part retainer. These are common retainer setups. The first retainer setup is a 2-part retainer, which there's pros and cons because it's just math, right? 2-part retainers means you take the average fee. So let's say you're working on a search of 100 grand and 20% fee at 20%, right? This isn't common. This is not normal. Obviously, most retained searches are on more senior roles, but just for the sake of math, it's super easy. 100 grand times 20%. Now you charge the client. The average price for this candidate profile is probably going to be around 100 grand. So that will be the number we're going to use. We're going to multiply by 20%, which is the negotiated client rate. Again, too low. You really should be pushing for 25 to 30. But regardless, all right, fine. Let's do 20% at 100 grand. Again, for math's sake, it's easy. That means it's 20 grand. 20 grand divided by 2. Now you have a 2-part retainer. And the client's going to give you 10 grand up front to initiate the search. You're going to take that 10 grand and you're going to just be happy that now it's like, fine, I owe the client about $10,000 worth of work. And for that, I'm going to give them a market map. I'm going to go and really dive deep into the search. Retainers are good for headhunters in the sense that if you're serious about filling a search, it locks down the search for you, first of all, on exclusive. So other people won't come on in and recruit for the job, which is competitively very advantageous. If you're in a niche market and you want to gain market share over your competitors, it is smart to sell retained straight up right away, because you set yourself apart from your competitors from a branding perspective. You are a more premium provider. And the expectation is that, if you don't retain me today, you're going to retain me tomorrow. And that's really nice because, again, you lock up the business on exclusive financially. There's one thing about exclusive contingent, and there's another thing about being retained. Because by being retained, a client isn't stupid enough to sign on to more contracts with other recruiters to have them recruit for the rec, because it's financially disadvantageous to them. And they have already given you their full loyalty to have you fill the search, which is why they're giving you 10 grand. Because if they give you 10 grand and they sign on a bunch of other recruiters and those people fill the search, then they just wasted the 10 grand. You can't even blame me. If I'm the headhunter and you gave me 10 grand and you got 5 other headhunters on the rec, and by the time I make my rounds, all the candidates, it's just a hot mess where everybody's just like tearing up submittals and just like double duplicates everywhere. Whose fault is that? It's obviously the client's fault. Easy money, 10 grand, see you later, you're an idiot, right? Deservedly so. So clients won't do that. If they give you the 10 grand, they're not going to give the business to somebody else. And this is very, very great. And obviously the other half of the payment is due per normal terms. Once the candidate starts, the rest of the payment then gets put through according to the payment schedule, whatever, 7 days, 14 days, 30 days, whatever the heck you negotiate. And the second piece of the retainer is going to be mathematically adjusted to equal the candidate's total salary, right? So let's say the candidate, instead of being 100 grand, is 120 grand. Then obviously the second half payment would be higher than the 10 grand that they initially gave you, because now we have a missing piece. And same goes for if the number is lower than expected. Let's say the candidate ended up being 90 grand. Then the second part of the retainer would only be $8,000. So that's kind of how retainers work from a math perspective. Now, 3-part retainer, the only difference is the second piece of the retainer is actually paid out upon start of interviews. Now, the reason why this isn't a good option that you can offer, even though it kind of takes away money from upfront, it's a good plan because it shows the clients you're serious about delivering, right? Because we're expecting that not only are we going to just do the market mapping, which is the initiation of the search, we're going to actually come through with interviews, right? So that's why I'm going to collect my second piece of my retainer on the initiation of the interviews. The day the first interview commences is the day that you're going to see an invoice for this second piece of the retainer. And for easy math's sake, let's say it's a $30K fee. The initiation fee is 10 grand. The second piece is 10 grand. And the third piece is what we talked about earlier, which is the remainder of whatever the heck the candidate ends up truly being. And of course, everyone negotiates differently. You could try to negotiate on full comp, not just base. You could try to negotiate on percentage point, not 20, but 25 to 30 to maybe 35%. Again, you should have all sorts of pricing strategies that is something that you personally consider depending on your strength in the market, what you think you're comfortable with, and what works for your organization if you are working for another recruitment business and you're not self-employed. Obviously, if you're self-employed, you have so many different directions that you can go with pricing. Another model that I've heard people do, which isn't exactly the same as retained but close enough, is what they call containment. Basically, they just get a flat fee up front and then they just negotiate some discount on the back end to then bill a lot. And every recruiter's different. You run your desk however you want. I'm just more of a traditional easy peasy like percentage person. Like it's either a 2-part or 3-part, and I expect to be paid accordingly. And so when you're talking to clients about retained search, it's really to evaluate what is their need, how realistic is it, and I'll leave you with this last tip, which is critical to understand from each client as it relates to should I be retained by them or not, because there is a certain degree of opportunity cost that you are missing out on for sure. The time that you are spent catering to one client is time that you are losing to service the wider market. Not only that, your client will feel like they own you and they are entitled to you because they have paid a price. So you have to realistically think, how fast can I unload this search? How fast can I actually fill this rec so I get it off my back so that I can go ahead and make the money that I usually make? And that's why as a rec to rec, what I currently do now, I don't offer retained at all anymore. We tried some retainers and it just doesn't work for my market because the average fee size is not high enough that it's really worth doing retained, right? So my old searches, when I was doing executive search, we're talking fees of 90 to 100 grand plus. In those scenarios, 100% you should pitch retained. And yeah, you should probably get retained, right? Because then you lock up the client. In that market, it's more client driven as well. So you want to lock the client down. Whereas in my market now, it's uber candidate driven. So in extremely candidate driven markets, you also want to think twice before committing yourself to a client, because typically to respect the search, you can't just take the candidates that you find during the search and shop them out. It's just kind of a moral thing there. That's kind of weird, right? Like if a client pays you whatever, 15, 30, 20K up front, and you're taking those candidates and you're just shopping them out, the client might be a little bit annoyed and mad. Like, what the hell is this all about? So of course, as part of the retained pitch, I would tell a client, I will give you 2 weeks exclusive. Right now, you can be generous and give them 3 weeks. You might be even more generous and give them 1 month. I will not give a client full on exclusivity forever. I gotta make a living, right? Like I'm doing you the favor of servicing the search, and I have a high degree of closing because I'm a market expert. I'm doing you the favor of committing myself to you. You're doing the favor of committing yourself to me. We both agree that I will fill this search, but you also can't just sit on these profiles for weeks on end. That is not how recruitment works. Like, I'm still a business person and we need to get on. I'm not your HR person. I'm not your internal recruiter. So I do have other clients, and you get a certain amount of exclusivity. And the client should be very reasonable and say, absolutely, like, I'm going to get back to you within 24 hours. So of course, yeah, give me the candidate for at least 2 to 3 weeks. Let me try my best to work them through our process. And then that way, when you do recruit the candidate, you also should explain that to them 100%. It's very important to be ethical and let the candidate know, hey, I have been retained by this particular client. Candidates love that, by the way. They love retained. They think it sounds so bougie. It's really just, they don't know. But anyways, so you're telling candidate, listen, you got to go with my client for 3 weeks. I expect you to not interview with other companies because this is a retained search. I really want you to give them the best shot. And the reason why it's beneficial to the candidate is because you need to explain to the candidate that this is a really great rec, and that's why you took it on retained. So you can rest assured, candidate, that this is a really good search. It's going to pay very well, which is another key factor, the key factor on retained searches. If your client does not pay market rates, or at the very least, and if not premium rates, if the client cannot just buy talent, do not get retained by them because you can't win, right? Retainers, there is a certain time, expectation, right? Because I'm paying you up front, I expect a result in a relatively timely manner. Because there is no luxury of time, they have to pay premium. Because when it comes time to make offers, like, you want to woo this candidate? Here, look, I brought them to you. You got to pay them 40 grand to get them to move. That's how much it's going to cost. You win on price. That's what that works and looks like in STEM markets, right? Like, why should this candidate leave their perfectly fine career at Joe Schmo Pharma Company and come work for you, a VC or a biotech firm, if you don't pay them more than the risk that it costs them to move? You have to pay market premium. If you can't pay market premium, I don't think we shouldn't do retained. 100% we shouldn't, because then you're taking your chances, right? The candidate will not move. It doesn't matter how many I bring to you. I can bring you 100 of these people and they still won't move because they're rational, logical, thinking, educated people. They're not going to risk their family's livelihood for your biotech company and leave their, like, Johnson & Johnson, where they get freaking consumer good discounts that's worth like tens of thousands of dollars a year, to come and join you guys for the same base salary. That's insane, right? So you got to pay a market premium. And if you're not ready for that, absolutely not. We are not going to do retained. You can just be contingent. We'll just see. We'll see if my candidates end up being interested, okay? So again, it's all about consulting with your client, educating them, and ultimately deciding for yourself and your business, do I want to be retained or not? And don't limit yourself to thinking retain has to only be for executives. That's not true. I got retained plenty of times for mid-level jobs, like 130K salary. I was like, okay, you're middle of nowhere. Yeah, I expect a retainer, right? Like, hey, you want me to go look for people in this tiny town in Delaware? Yeah, I want a retainer. At least sell, at least try, right? At least try to get the retainer. If not, you still can use them as contingent, ideally exclusive contingent, if not just regular contingent, and see what happens, right? It all has to do with your interest level to service the search. Make sure to think about this a little bit more. If you look at my other videos, you will get a lot more information, and certainly tune into the DG Recruit podcast, where I do talk plenty about how to sell retainers, how retainers work. There's over 100 episodes in there. You just kind of have to dig around to find the right one.